before all of you joined, we're going to have a very special guest here. It's been my joy living in Eastern Connecticut and in New London to get to know many wonderful people. But when I was preparing this lecture, I learned that one of the first, the first kibbutz in Israel, one of the founders, one of, I think, 14 people, his last name was Barretts, as in the Barretts that we have in our congregation, Fran Barretts, and her son, Bruce. So I called up Bruce and I said, Bruce, did you know, because I had taken him to Israel on a mission and he knew he had met with relatives. I said, did you know that one of your relatives might have been a founder of the kibbutz? He said, yeah, of course I knew it. I called him up. This guy lives in Cleveland. My phone was for some reason in his cell phone. So he actually answered the phone and we talked, and he's going to join us at 5 minutes to 7. So we'll have a grandson of the first child to be born on a kibbutz in Israel. The son of the first will tell us stories about Tiganya, and he's going to join us at around 5 to 7. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background and ask a few questions, which I think you'll be able to answer. When did the Jews start to leave Europe? What was the reason they started to leave? Anybody? Unmute yourself and answer. Why did the Jews start?
Pogroms?
Inquisition?
Pogroms. Now, where did they go? Where did they go?
America? U.S.?
America. Second country they might have gone to?
Argentina.
Argentina. They came west. Do you think a whole lot of people went to Palestine?
No.
No. The history of immigration to Palestine is a history of waves of immigration. They're called aliyot, and they actually have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then illegal immigration. The aliyot did start in response to the pogroms, but they were also a response to the rebellion against the Tsar and the revolution in Russia. The first Aliyah, however, which is from 1882 to 1903, had 3 components. The first component was a religious component. They wanted to go back to their historic homeland. And believe it or not, people felt that it was good to die in Israel. You want to go back to the land of Israel, and you want to get there, and you want to die, and then where do you think you want to be buried? Somebody knows this.
The Mount of Olives.
Right, the Mount of Olives, Har HaZeitim. Anybody know why you want to be buried at the Mount of Olives? And how you're oriented when you're buried? When you're buried on the Mount of Olives, you're buried with your feet facing the Temple Mount.
So you can be resurrected.
So when you get up from being dead, you walk straight to the Temple Mount. So all of the graves on Har HaZeitim, the feet are pointing towards the Temple Mount. The first Aliyah was inspired by 2 organizations, or one organization, Chibat Zion, Lovers of Zion, and a movement called the Bilu, Beit Yaakov, Lech V'Nelchu. And they came in two influxes, 1882 to 1884, and then again 1890 to 1891. And they were not a lot of people, 25,000 people altogether. And before they came, there were as few as 5,000 Jews living in Palestine. And the bulk of them lived in Jerusalem. Some lived in a little village in the Galil called Pekin, which has a romantic meaning for us because they say it was the one Jewish village that had continuous Jewish occupation from the first temple on. But most of the Jews were religious Jews. They lived in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden, people started showing up. Now, the big cities on the East Coast, name them for me. What are the big cities on the East Coast of America?
New York, Boston, Philadelphia.
Thank you. And what do they all have in common? They're all
Water, ports.
right, which means they're ports. They're all ports. So the Jews that were coming to Palestine all landed in the same port that Jonah used. What port was that? Jerry Schwell, what port was that?
Yaffo.
Yaffo. They all landed in Jaffa. So Jaffa was also a walled city, and the walled city of Jaffa and the walled city of Jerusalem were getting filled with Jews. Filled with Jews. The early settlers were supported by the Alliance Israélite Universelle and by a philanthropist who you've heard of, Edmund de Rothschild. And that was the first Aliyah, 1882 to 1903. It was not a successful Aliyah. People literally were starving. They were being shifted from Rishon LeZion to Gedera. Some of them went back to Europe. It was not a successful Aliyah. And there was also that move the Jews to Uganda. So it was depressing economically. It was depressing mentally. And then Herzl dies 1904. But the Kishinev pogroms in 1903 push another group of Jews towards Palestine. Now, don't forget, all this time, literally over 1 million Jews are coming to America. We talked about 25,000 in the first Aliyah. In the second Aliyah, these were not religious people. They were young men and women who were actually revolutionaries, and they were sparked by the Kishinev pogrom, but they were very ideological, very ideological. And they were interested in creating a Jewish working class, a Jewish labor class that would be part of the workers of the world and would join this Russian Revolution. However, they worked as hired laborers. And they followed the philosophy of a socialist Zionist called Ber Borochov, and a return to the land philosopher called Aleph Dalet Gordon. And they were the ones who started the first kibbutz in I think it was 1909. And they also started the first all-Jewish city, which is what? Raise your hand and we'll unmute you. What's the first Jewish city?
Tel Aviv.
Tel Aviv, right. And Tel Aviv was a suburb of Jaffa. Remember, Jaffa was a walled city. The Jews were crammed in there. They were uncomfortable. They were unhappy. They busted out and they set up Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was like Scarsdale. It was, or like Central Park West. You know, they got out of Lower Manhattan. They got out of the cramped port city and they built another city. Now, the second Aliyah ended in 1914. All of you know enough world history to know why that happened. What war broke out in 1914? Yes? Carla?
World War I.
Right. And Palestine, until World War I, was under the administration of the Ottoman Empire. So from 1914 till 1919, there was essentially no Aliyah. And then in 1919, Aliyah resumed. And we're now at the third Aliyah. The third Aliyah was a little more large. It brought 35,000 immigrants to Israel. But they didn't come unprepared. This time they came from Zionist youth movements, and they began to really be
Jerry, you're frozen. I don't know if you can hear us.
we're returning to the land, we're returning to work. I'm frozen. Let me take the view.
Yeah,
We're
you were
returning
from
to land, we're returning to work. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can.
All right, I'm gonna leave the camera off for a while. Now, the third Aliyah was really the transformative Aliyah. The third Aliyah established the Histadrut. The third Aliyah said, we're gonna stop hiring Arab labor and we're going to become laborers ourselves. And the third Aliyah was largely Russian, 53% Russian, 36% Polish, and the rest from Ethiopia, from Lithuania, Romania, and Eastern Europe. The fourth Aliyah,
Wait.
and we're gonna, yes?
How long did the third Aliyah last?
From 1919 to 1923.
Okay, that's when Dan's father went with his
Oh.
family.
Okay,
He was 10 years old.
and where did he come from?
Well, I've heard Poland. I've also heard the Ukraine. I'm not sure.
All right. So the third Aliyah was really big in setting up kibbutzim and moshavim. Really, really important. 1919 to 1923. And I'm going to talk now about one kibbutz, Ein HaShofet, to give you an idea of what was going on in Palestine. Ein HaShofet was founded by a group of people who were in the Zionist youth movement called Hashomer Hatzir, and they came from Poland. Another group from Hashomer Hatzir came from Highland Mills, New York. The group, which was called a garin, a seed, was formed in 1922, and they got to Mishmar HaEmek in 1931. And they founded Kibbutz Ein HaShofet. Kibbutz Ein HaShofet literally means the well or the spring of the judge. Who do you think the judge was that they were naming this kibbutz after?
Raise your hand.
Justice Brandeis.
Deborah?
Scholar. English Ein HaShofet.
Who?
But the story of Ein HaShofet is the story of how kibbutzim, especially in the Jezreel Valley and around the Kinneret, came to be. The land where Ein HaShofet is situated was bought from an effendi. An effendi is an Arab absentee landlord who has peasants literally working his land, and he gets a tithe of it. Ein HaShofet bought the land from an effendi family in Haifa, whose name was Salah. They bought the land, and they also paid the Arab tenant farmers to leave. And then they started working at Ein HaShofet. But Ein HaShofet was not the first kibbutz. I wanted to tell you the story of Ein HaShofet because it's Justice Brandeis and the money he gave to help establish it. But I see that Oren Barretts has joined, and I'm going to unmute you, Oren. And Bruce or Fran, if you're on the call, please raise your hands. I'd like you all to meet Oren Barretts. Can you find him? It says Barretts' iPad. Everybody, can you raise your hand if you can see him? Good, good, good. So Oren, Bruchim Habayim, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm very excited that you joined us. As I told you by way of introduction, Oren is the grandson of one of the settlers of the first kibbutz in Israel, Daganya, and maybe he'll tell you what that Hebrew word means. And then he's going to tell you a few good favorite stories of his in kibbutz Daganya. Oren now works for the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. He's senior vice president, and I'll talk a little bit later on about the generations that came after the founders. Bavakasha, Oren.
Why don't you just tell the group how we actually met today?
I did. I told them that
okay.
I called up Bruce Barretts. I said, Bruce, when I took you to Israel, you know, yeah, I'm related to the guy who founded Kibbutz Daganya. And then he gave me numbers. And then I laughed because you said that my phone number was in your cell phone, which was
right.
Yeah.
So before I begin, I would love to see who Bruce is, because I'm trying to see. I'm swiping here. Is Bruce on the call?
I don't think he is, but let me call him on my cell phone and find out why he isn't.
Okay. So first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's great being here with you. And as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not exactly from Cleveland. I'm a little bit east of there. Not even New York. I'm from Israel. The moment Jeremy, told me about the session there, I said, "Hey, I have to get on it because I'm a schmoozer, and I love to tell stories. So if I have an opportunity to tell stories and about the kibbutz and my family, what can be better?" And Jeremy, you'll have to stop me because when I begin going, I can forget myself. So I'm an Israeli. You can be rude with me. You can tell me that I've over extended my invitation, so it's okay. So just a little bit of background. My grandparents came to Palestine in 1905. My grandfather, Joseph Baratz, was 15 years old from Kishinev. My grandmother, Miriam, was 16 years old, and she came from the Ukraine. They didn't know, of course, one another. And they were part of what's called the second Aliyah, the second wave of immigrants that began coming to Israel in 1904, 1905, as a result of the pogroms, and especially the Kishinev pogrom that happened in 1904. And they were part of this wave of young Jewish immigrants who were very ideological, and their movement was very ideological, and they were socialists, not communists, socialists, where they believed that the solution for the anti-Semitism in Eastern and Central Europe is by creating this movement of socialist young Jews who believe in Zionism. And so the solution for anti-Semitism in Europe is the migration of Jews to Palestine then, in order to create a homeland for Jews in Palestine. By the way, the whole second wave of immigrants, surprisingly, was about not more than 20,000 people. And after about 10, 15 years, only about 10,000 stayed in what today is Israel. Many of them died. Some of them went back to Russia to become communists, and some of them immigrated to the United States. And that group of teenage rebels actually became the backbone of the whole establishment of the State of Israel. They were the the Ben-Gurions and the Dayans and the Galilis and our founding parents. They created all the institutions, the Histadrut, the Haganah, the political parties, and until 1977, they're actually the leaders. They and their children are the leaders of Israel. Another thing which is part of their ideology is that they want to create a new Jew. And you'll see soon how I'm going to echo that. And they want to create a new Jew, a Jew which is not a merchant, not a academic person, but is a strong Jew connected to the land. And the connection to the land is manifested itself by being a farmer. And then they come to Palestine, and there's already a group of Jews that immigrated from Central Europe between 1882 and 1884, which is what's called the first Aliyah, and they create all kinds of farms. But who are the actual employees in the farms? Are the Arabs. And those young rebels that come in the beginning of the 20th century, they want to conquer the agricultural work from the Arabs, but the farmers don't want to let them because they have no experience in being farmers. And that is actually the impotence for the creation of the kibbutz movement, because they say, okay, they will not let us work, so we are going to create our own farms. And in 1909, a group of 7 men and 2 women get land on the southern shores of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, and begin the first kibbutz in Israel. And the first kibbutz in Israel is actually was begun by my grandparents, because my grandfather was one of the 7 men. My grandmother was one of the 2 women. They were not married yet. And they create this socialist agricultural commune. And in order to understand what it means and how ideological driven they were, they create this commune where nobody owns any private property, and they make all their decisions about every aspect of their lives as a commune, and they decide democratically about everything. And here I want to tell you a couple of stories. So first of all, one of the first decisions they made, that for 5 years, so if they were established in 1909 until 1914, there'll be no kids born in the kibbutz, in order to allow themselves to establish themselves economically and as a commune. My grandparents get married, and an accident happens. My father gets born. My father is actually the first baby ever to be born in the kibbutz movement. And when he's born, every Saturday night after dinner, they used to have their commune meetings, where all the members of the kibbutz used to get together, and there used to be an agenda for topics to discuss and decide. And they used to have discussions and voting and deciding. And to that meeting, after the first Saturday after my father was born, it's 1913, they bring there are 3 decisions which are brought for a resolution. First of all, the whole commune, about 30 or 40 people, are going to decide how to call my dad. And they have a whole debate, and they choose a name. Now, what do you think the name they chose? The name they chose was Adam the First. Now, why did they choose a name? It wasn't by chance. It wasn't just a name. Because in their eyes, he was the first fruit of their dreams to create a new Jew, a Jew which is connected to the land. Now, my grandmother gets up and she says, after the decision was made, I will make the decision what to call the baby. And she called him Gideon, after the prophet Gideon. The second decision was that my grandmother for a whole year will not work and raise the baby. And then she stands up again and she says, I will make the decision. And 3 days after the baby was born, she put him in a cot, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, like she did before, and like she did for the next 40 years, she took him at 3 o'clock in the morning to the cow shed, because she managed the cow shed and she milked the cows. And by the way, there's today a modern research that was done by a woman in the Bar Ilan University who did a master's thesis, where she claims that my grandmother, according to modern definitions of feminism, is actually the first Israeli modern feminist. The third decision was brought by a man called Shmuel Dayan. Shmuel Dayan is the father of Moshe Dayan. I guess many of you have heard his name, who was a member of the kibbutz too. And the decision he wanted to pass is that my grandparents will be expelled from the kibbutz. And why is that? Because they did not keep the decision not to have babies for 5 years. My father was born after 3 years. And of course, the decision was that, the kibbutz did not agree to expel my grandparents. But guess what happened after 4 months? Another baby was born, and his name was Moshe Dayan, and he wasn't a preemie. and Moshe Dayan's mother could not breastfeed, and my grandmother breastfed both my father and Moshe Dayan. And Moshe Dayan, until my grandmother died, every year on Hanukkah, which was used to be her birthday, used to come, especially to kibbutz, to wish her a happy birthday. Now, just to understand how ideological driven they were. In those years, you remember I said they didn't own anything? They didn't even own their own clothing. They didn't even own their own underpants. And in the committee meetings that they used to have every Saturday night, and I saw a protocol. Whenever I go and visit the kibbutz, I go to the archives because I love to read stuff about the history. And I found a protocol where they're having a debate. Are they going to buy 20 pounds of wheat grain in order to plant in the fields? Or are they going to buy 10 new underpants for all the members? So I can sit here for hours and tell you more stories, but I don't want to hijack your discussion. And I want to really thank Jeremy for inviting me. And I'll stay on the call if it's okay with you and hear what Jeremy have to say. And if there are any stories, I'd be happy. Any questions, I'd be happy to answer. So Jeremy, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all until the end. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and we all appreciate it. I want to go back to the question of World War I and the post-World War I third Aliyah, and then the fourth Aliyah, which was 1924 to 1928. The fourth Aliyah was perhaps the middle class Aliyah. It was the Aliyah where they established stores. They created a middle class that was not based on the kibbutz or the moshav.
I think we lost Jerry. Can anybody else hear him?
Nope.
Can
No.
you hear me?
And Rena, he doesn't have his video on because the sound works better without the video.
Right.
That's why he
Yeah,
turned. He's back. Go ahead, Jerry.
All right. So did you hear the third and fourth Aliyah, but particularly the fourth Aliyah, created a middle class in Israel, shopkeepers, professional people. The fourth Aliyah had more people because America closed its gates. America closed its gates in 1924, and people who wanted to get out of Europe could not come to America. So 67,000 Jews came to Palestine in 1924. The fifth Aliyah, which is the 10 years before the war, or the 11 years before the war, 1929 to 1939, saw 250,000.
Jerry, we couldn't hear that. It's how many came in 1929 to 39? You cut out.
A 250,000.
Okay.
250,000. All right. And they came to Haifa and Jerusalem. And to this day, the influence of German Jews in Haifa, especially regarding bakeries and food styles, you can still feel. The British took over Palestine after World War I. They were given the mandate. And they faced some real challenges. One of the real challenges was the Arab Revolt. There had been a riot against the Jews in Jaffa. There had been riots against the Jews in other cities, but there was an organized Arab revolt that started in 1936 and went on for 3.5 years. And that Arab revolt essentially, I think, told the British, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. But before they left, they did quite a bit. And one of the things they did was to appoint as the very first High Commissioner of Palestine a Jew, Herbert Samuel. Herbert Samuel had already tried to convince the British to endorse the settlement of Palestine by Jews, and he didn't succeed. But Chaim Weizmann got Balfour to make the Balfour Declaration. And then in 1920, in June, Herbert Samuel was appointed the High Commissioner for Palestine and went to Israel. He bent over backwards to try and treat the Arabs and the Jews equally, and he got clobbered on both sides. The Jews thought he was being too nice to the Arabs. The Arabs thought he was a Jew and all he was doing is paving the way for the Jews to take over Palestine. And he didn't last long. He lasted 5 years. When he arrived, he was welcomed with a gigantic welcome from the Yishuv, from the Jewish community in Palestine. And when he left, they said, "Geh gesund hey, you really didn't help us that much. You didn't help us." And this is a moment where you have to understand why the kibbutz movement was so important. The kibbutz movement ran out to the periphery of Palestine and overnight would build a tower and a stockade and declare a settlement, so that when partition really happened, the borders of Israel were really defined by kibbutzim that were set up on the periphery of the
I think we lost Jerry again. Jerry? Yeah, we can't hear you, Jerry.
All right, let's can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I was saying kibbutzim were set up on the periphery of the country, almost as overnight things. They would run out, build a tower and build a stockade and say, this is a Jewish settlement. And that was very important in the final definition of the state of Israel. But I want to tell you the names of some of the kibbutzim. You heard about Tiganya, the first kibbutz. Degen is grain. Tiganya could be the grain of God. Yah is God. Then there's Ein Harod, the springs of King Herod. Then there's another kibbutz, which was the first Hashomer HaTzir kibbutz, and that's called Beit Alpha. And that was the kibbutz that Isaac Bashevis Singer's son settled. Then there's a kibbutz named after the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, Mordechai Analevich. And that kibbutz is called Yad Mordechai. And then there's a kibbutz named after the ghetto fighters in Vilna and Warsaw mainly, and that's called Kibbutz Lochamei HaGetaot, the ghetto fighters kibbutz. Then there's the kibbutz named after Masaryk, Kfar Masaryk. And then there's Ein HaShofet, named after Justice Brandeis. And then there's some biblical names. There's a kibbutz that's now in the city limits of Jerusalem called Ramat Rachel, where Rachel was. And then there are kibbutzim that are literally named after, we're here to guard this land. And that kibbutz is Mishmar Emek. Now, in our community, Morris Malov, along with two other Connecticut Zionists, spent money to buy land from the Effendis, from the absentee landowners, and establish kibbutzim. So Kibbutz Geva, which is also in the Jezreel Valley, was essentially paid for by money raised by and donated by Morris Malov and to also new name.
Hey, Jerry, we're hearing about every fourth word.
I'm sorry. I apologize. I apologize.
And now we're not hearing you at all.
You can't hear me at all?
I hear you now, but I didn't hear you before that.
You heard me talk about the Malovs? And Kibbutz
Yes.
Geva? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I wonder if a system, Jerry, would be for you to look at Kathleen, and as soon as Kathleen raises her hand, you know that you're not audible.
Okay. Is that all
You
right
see
with
what I
you?
mean? So that we have a way
Sure.
of signaling it immediately.
Sure.
Oh. I want to close this session by talking in personal terms about the kibbutz. Because my uncle was a founder of a kibbutz. I lived on a kibbutz I lived on 3 kibbutzim for a period of 6 months. Kibbutz was truly a communal effort. There were no televisions on kibbutz. When I went to Israel in July of 1966, I went to Kibbutz Galon. It had been settled by Americans. There was no television. Everybody went to what they called the clubhouse to play chess, to talk, to read magazines. They had a Sichat Kibbutz, a kibbutz meeting once a week, and they showed movies in the kibbutz dining room. That was July of 1966. There was still a children's house. So all of my little cousins did not live with their parents. They lived in the children's house. And I was a little bit surprised about it. But my aunt and uncle said, when they come to stay with us for 2 hours, we're done with work. We don't have to make meals for them because they've been fed in the children's house. We don't have to make meals for ourselves because we're going to be fed in the dining room. So we're spending the entire 2 hours just playing with our children. And then they said to me,
Jerry?
don't you think that's better? You can't hear me?
No, it's Ella. Just a side remark, until today, there's a lot of children that are survivors of this communal sleeping that have real serious PTSD and a lot of psychological issues from that. Some of the kibbutzim were so extreme, they wouldn't even let the moms of newborn come and feed them or
Oh
cuddle
yeah,
them. when they
some of
fly.
the kids, some of the kids were so feminist and anti.
No, it had nothing to do with
No,
feminine.
it did.
had
Listen,
to do
Ella,
with
let me finish.
yeah. And you're gone.
I really want to hear what Jerry has to say. Jerry? Raise my hand. Say it again, Jerry.
Husband and wife did not refer to each other as Baal, you own me, and but Ishi, my man. And there were actually rules that when you went to the dining room, a husband and wife couldn't sit together. They had to be part of the community and not a marriage. Anyhow, when I went back to Kibbutz Galon in early '67, they had allowed all the members to get televisions. And televisions completely changed the tone of the kibbutz. So that instead of going to the Moadan, to the clubhouse, to find things to do, everybody was staying home and watching television. And because of that, all of a sudden, everybody wanted to cook at home so they could watch their TV shows at home. So the television essentially destroyed communal life on the kibbutz. Kibbutz finally began to privatize.
Can't hear you, Jerry.
Labor. You can't hear me.
We heard the kibbutz finally began to privatize.
I know, I got you.
We didn't hear anything after that.
Right. The kibbutz finally began to privatize because people said, wait a minute, I can take a 60-minute drive to Tel Aviv and I can make a whole lot of money. So why do I have to stay on kibbutz? But my parents have this house and I have this house. So kibbutz began to privatize. And
Kibbutz began to privatize and we didn't hear you. Jerry, we don't know.
laws who could not earn money working privately. Did you hear that?
Kibbutz began to privatize and then what?
And the government forced them to pass laws to protect the people on the kibbutz who could not earn money in the private sector. If you were 55 years old and your kibbutz is privatizing, you can't go out and get a job. And you've lived on the kibbutz for 55 years. So the kibbutz has a guaranteed income for members. And even as they privatize and they create private ownership, there's a fund that supports kibbutz members who cannot go and earn a good living off of the kibbutz. Kibbutz was a very respected part of Israeli society. Oren Baratz's grandfather wrote a book about Tiganya. When it was published in English, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote the foreword to the book. And Eleanor Roosevelt went to Israel and visited Kibbutz Tiganya. And after the war, many non-Jews from Europe came to Israel and volunteered on kibbutz. Some of them even set up kibbutzim.
Okay, Jerry, we can't hear you, and I'm going to have to leave. I have another meeting. So I will leave Jerry to close.
And Jerry, I'm
I
gonna
think we're gonna call.
take advantage. Yeah, I was
And
gonna
next
take
week-
advantage of. Yeah, sorry.
Next week, I'm gonna try and get a better setup to do my last lecture. Thank you very much.